December 16th, 1944. Ardennes Forest, Western Front. Gefreiter Otto Weber, a 19-year-old infantryman in the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, stood in the dark tree line, his hand resting on the cold metal of his rifle. The ground vibrated under him as German artillery batteries completed their final checks behind the line. A watch officer close by whispered, "Bereit machen." "Get ready." Weber pulled the strap of his helmet tighter. He checked his ammunition pouch again. 6 magazines, 1 ration bar, a charcoal-fired field stove still warm inside a nearby foxhole. Artillery crews lowered their heads. Silence. Then, at 5:20, the forest snapped open. A full barrage tore across the American positions ahead of them. Weber watched the flashes strobe against the fog. White, then orange, then gone. Shrapnel hissed overhead. The concussion thumped in his chest. "This is it," he muttered to himself, barely audible over the guns. No speeches, no emotion. Just the order to advance once the fire lifted. And when it did, Weber stepped forward with the first wave, moving through churned earth and drifting smoke toward a front he had only seen on maps. The attack Weber walked into was not a local engagement. It was Operation Watch on the Rhine, Adolf Hitler's last major gamble on the Western Front. The plan called for more than 400,000 German soldiers, over 1,000 tanks and assault guns, and the largest artillery concentration the Western Front had seen since 1940. All of it had been moved into the Ardennes under strict secrecy. For weeks, units like Weber's had watched the forests fill with new conscripts, supply dumps, and charcoal-fueled kitchens. Roads had been restricted to one-way westbound traffic. To maintain silence, Gestapo officers patrolled villages and interrogated soldiers, while the Feldgendarmerie enforced discipline with harsh efficiency. Even the artillery officers only understood the scale of the operation once they were ordered to emplace their heavy guns facing west instead of east, a realization that confirmed a full offensive was coming. The strategic objective was ambitious: split the Allied armies, seize the Meuse crossings, and drive to Antwerp. If successful, the move could isolate the British and force a negotiated peace. Hitler believed the fog, the terrain, and the temporary grounding of Allied aircraft created a narrow window. But the numbers were already working against Germany. The offensive burned through fuel the Reich no longer had. Some divisions were filled with teenagers, men recovering from wounds, or soldiers recently pulled from garrison duty. Even in the SS formations, discipline had been strained by months of retreat. The ground itself, steep ridges, single-lane roads, and deep forests, favored defense, not rapid armored thrusts. Yet the appearance of strength was enough. On paper, the initial attack could rupture the American line. In practice, the plan required perfect timing, rapid breakthroughs, and weather that held long enough to keep Allied aircraft grounded. Any delay, one roadblock, one immobilized tank column, one unexpected pocket of resistance, would begin a chain reaction Germany could not recover from. From his position in the trees, Gefreiter Otto Weber could not know this. He could only see the fog, hear the guns, and watch the men ahead of him vanish into the smoke. What he did not know was that the very obstacles Germany needed to avoid were already forming, quietly, invisibly, before the first wave had even cleared the forest. Gefreiter Otto Weber moved with the first wave as the barrage lifted, stepping over torn branches and shallow craters still warm from the shells. A man beside him muttered, "Just reach the ridge. Then we see." The words slipping into the fog as the column advanced. Behind them, the distant churn of engines rumbled through the trees like a low, uneven heartbeat. The opening assaults achieved their intended shock. American forward positions wavered, and local breakthroughs formed gaps in the line. German reports noted progress along the Losheim Gap, and staff officers traced the advance with cautious confidence. But as the front pushed outward, problems surfaced behind it. Units expected to move in coordinated waves found themselves dispersed or delayed. Fog concealed their approach, yet the same fog slowed runners, supply teams, and armored escorts trying to keep pace with the infantry. Kampfgruppe Peiper's advance revealed the first major fault. The armored group had been assigned a decisive role: penetrate the American line near Lanzerath and accelerate west before resistance could harden. Instead, the route ahead remained blocked for most of the day. A small American reconnaissance platoon held a ridge that the waiting paratroopers had not yet cleared. Panzer crews sat in idle lines, engines rumbling as hours passed and the schedule shifted further from the operational plan. Once movement resumed, terrain compounded the delay. The forest roads, narrow single-lane tracks, were never meant for massed armor. By late morning, the once frozen surface had softened into slick mud. A panther caught in a rut slid sideways and jammed the path behind it. Engineers worked quickly, but each stationary vehicle produced a chain of halted trucks, fuel carriers, and half-tracks, stretching far into the rear. At choke points, battalion officers paced along the column, calculating time losses they could no longer ignore. Higher headquarters began noticing the growing discrepancies between planned and actual movement times. Their maps, marked with precise advance rates, were now cluttered with notes from field units reporting stalled traffic, breakdowns, and lost hours. Commanders studying the timetable understood what these delays implied. The offensive had been designed around speed, and speed was already slipping beyond reach. A half-track sat crooked on the roadside with its hood open, steam drifting from the engine block as the driver tried to restart it. Men stepped around the vehicle, boots caked with mud, and continued toward their assembly points without slowing. Radio messages arrived broken and incomplete, and runners sent to bypass the congestion returned far later than expected. The momentum that should have carried the attack forward was thinning at the edges. Still, optimism persisted at the front. Reports arrived that elements of the American 106th Infantry Division had been surrounded. A breach near Blyalf encouraged the belief that the route toward the Meuse might yet open. The infantry saw what was directly before them. They did not see the supply column miles behind them, bogging down in the forest. Peiper resumed his westward push near nightfall. His armored units advanced in darkness, moving without headlights, engines throttled low to preserve fuel. But the recovery effort came too late. The lost hours pushed consumption beyond what had been allocated. Every kilometer now required fuel that Germany no longer possessed in reserve. Commanders monitoring the advance recognized the pattern. Delays multiplied demand, multiplied friction, and tightened every margin the plan had depended on. Operationally, the offensive was still moving. Strategically, its foundation was weakening. The timetable had been the backbone of the entire attack, and it had already begun to bow under the weight of terrain, congestion, and uneven progress. Even American resistance, still fragmented in many sectors, was no longer the main barrier to success. A larger threat was approaching from beyond the tree line. The weather window that had sheltered the advance was narrowing, and a clearer sky would change the balance of the battle in a single day. The men on the ground could not see it yet, but the first shadows of a coming shift were already creeping into the operation's path. A junior officer in Kampfgruppe Peiper marked the night's progress on his map by lantern light, the flame wavering as he tried to steady his hand. The line he traced ran west, but not far enough. Their column had advanced, yet the gap between expectation and reality was widening with every hour lost. As Peiper's vanguard pushed toward Stavelot, the wider German offensive began to split into uneven segments. Some units advanced quickly through scattered American positions, others struggled against terrain or stalled entirely behind immobilized armor. The plan required simultaneous pressure along multiple axes. Instead, the thrusts were staggered. Reports from the center indicated promising ground gained near Schönberg, but the northern elements were already behind schedule, and the southern formations were drifting out of alignment. American resistance, while inconsistent, now appeared in pockets strong enough to slow the advance. At St. Vith, U.S. forces consolidated around the road network and began contesting every approach. The town controlled key access to the paved routes Germany badly needed. German infantry pressed forward, but the defense held long enough to complicate every timetable associated with the Meuse. Objective commanders forwarding situation updates understood the implications. They could no longer assume the town would fall on the original schedule. Fuel shortages now added a sharper edge to every decision. Panzer units burned through their reserves, just maintaining position in the congested forest supply columns. Attempting to reach the front, encountered the same bottlenecks that had trapped the armor. Several trucks were abandoned after running dry, their crews joining infantry formations on foot. For an operation built on rapid armored exploitation, each lost vehicle represented more than a tactical inconvenience. It represented a structural failure in the offensive's design. The Reich had launched its largest western offensive of the war without fuel for prolonged maneuver, and the consequences were becoming visible across the forest roads. The encirclement of several regiments of the American 106th Infantry Division appeared at first to counter this unfavorable trend. German commanders cited it as evidence that the advance still possessed operational weight. But encirclement alone didn't open the roads west, and the Meuse crossings remained distant. The map showed a breakthrough. The ground conditions did not. At higher headquarters, staff officers reviewed updated movement logs and encountered a troubling pattern. Units that should have been 12 or 15 kilometers beyond their morning positions were still stalled in the same patches of woodland. One senior officer, pencil paused above his notebook, recognized that the offensive's internal architecture, its fragile dependence on pace, had begun to collapse. Meanwhile, at the front, the first signs of coordinated American reinforcement began to appear. Small groups of armored vehicles, engineers and infantry formations filtered into critical junctions near St. Vith and Malmedy. Their presence wasn't yet decisive, but it represented a shift. The Allies were stabilizing. The German advance was still moving forward on multiple axes, but no longer at a speed that could deliver the decisive rupture envisioned in the plan. The fog that had sheltered the offensive remained, but forecasts hinted at a coming change: clearer skies, colder nights, and conditions that would restore Allied air dominance. What waited behind that weather shift would determine whether the German attack compressed into a pocket of stalled armor or shattered entirely under the weight of the skies. A radio operator in Peiper's column adjusted his headset and listened to the static shift into a faint, broken transmission. American armor sighted near St. Vith. He wrote the note on a damp field pad, tore the page free, and passed it forward. The message moved through the line as quietly as the fog. The next phase of the offensive unfolded under growing strain. German formations converging on the road network around St. Vith found the junctions increasingly contested. American commanders had begun feeding reinforcements into the town, turning it into a pivot of resistance that absorbed time, fuel, and manpower. Three resources Germany had calculated with precision and could not replace: St. Vith's survival forced German units to reroute toward less suitable terrain, and the diversions fractured the cohesion of the advance. The effects multiplied quickly. Armored regiments approaching the Elsenborn Ridge encountered organized defensive lines manned by U.S. troops with artillery support. The ridge's elevation created natural firing positions, enabling American batteries to strike German columns as they attempted to force narrow approaches. Several battalions took unexpected casualties in these engagements. The delays produced by this resistance degraded the timing of the offensive's center, which no longer aligned with the movement of Peiper's northern thrust. Meanwhile, logistical friction deepened. Fuel convoys struggled to reach frontline units, and many were forced to abandon vehicles when supplies ran out. Mid-route infantrymen in the 26th Volksgrenadier Division were ordered to maintain pressure toward Bastogne, but even now they faced shortages. Bastogne's refusal to fall amplified the problem. Its road network served as the hub of the Ardennes region, and its defenders, held long enough to disrupt every German timetable tied to the Meuse advance units assigned to encircle the town, could not complete the maneuver at the planned speed. As the siege tightened, German commanders realized that without the paved roads leading through Bastogne, their armored divisions would remain confined to the overburdened forest tracks, a critical indication the offensive's strategic assumptions were collapsing. To the north, Peiper's attempt to regain momentum pushed deeper into Belgium, but the terrain and fuel constraints slowed the group. Bridges had to be seized intact or repaired under fire. American engineers destroyed several key crossings before withdrawing, forcing Peiper's column to detour repeatedly. Each diversion consumed precious hours and additional fuel, tightening the trap forming around the spearhead. At higher headquarters, staff monitored weather reports showing clearing skies approaching from the west. The shift threatened to restore Allied air power, which had been grounded. Since the start of the offensive, German units depended on continued cloud cover to protect their exposed columns. The possibility of clear weather, combined with the faltering timetable, introduced a new layer of urgency into every decision made at corps and army level. The offensive was still moving, but the internal architecture that supported it, fuel, roads, synchronized timing, was deteriorating faster than the frontline units could compensate. Saint-Vith remained in American hands. Bastogne held, and Peiper's spearhead had pushed so far ahead that its supply line now resembled a narrowing corridor more than a reliable route. As the weather front crept closer, the German advance braced for the one development that could break the operation outright: the return of Allied aircraft. A grenadier from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division paused along a tree line east of Bastogne and rubbed frost from the rim of his canteen cup. The water inside had already begun to freeze. He exhaled once, watched the breath drift, and moved on. By December 21st, the German advance had lost the rhythm that defined its early hours. Bastogne remained in American hands, and the town's defenders continued to hold the road network that Germany needed to funnel fuel and reinforcements toward the Meuse. Without those paved routes, the armored formations on the northern and central axes were forced back onto forest tracks already jammed with stalled vehicles. The inability to capture Bastogne on schedule introduced cascading delays across the entire front, with each hour slipping further out of alignment with the operational plan. At Saint-Vith, the situation hardened in similar fashion. American forces, reinforced and reorganized, built a defensive position capable of absorbing repeated attacks. German attempts to dislodge them consumed men and material Germany could not spare. Saint-Vith's continued resistance forced the 5th Panzer Army to divert units into secondary approaches far less suited for armored movement. The detours lengthened march times, drained fuel, and produced new congestion points. As these problems accumulated, The original strategic vision of a rapid breakout toward Antwerp narrowed into a series of localized battles that siphoned away the offensive's momentum. Kampfgruppe Peiper, which had once been the sharpest edge of the northern thrust, now bore the weight of these failures. Peiper's column pushed deeper into Belgium, but found its supply line thinning rather than extending. Fuel convoys could not keep pace. Ambushed vehicles, destroyed bridges, and blown culverts forced repeated rerouting. Each detour meant more fuel burned than planned. Crews abandoned tanks that ran dry and joined the infantry on foot. The spearhead, still tactically dangerous, was becoming strategically isolated. The worsening conditions heightened stress inside the German formations. The atmosphere was grim. A soldier striking a match with numb fingers to relight a field stove, the flame snapping out in the cold air before it caught. Supplies dwindled everywhere. Men assigned to siege positions outside Bastogne, sharing a single loaf of bread among 10. Others scavenged for anything that could serve as a meal. Hunger weakened discipline, and exhaustion made it harder to maintain pressure against American counterattacks. At higher headquarters, weather reports marked a turning point. Forecasts predicted clearing skies within 48 hours. This development, insignificant in a normal campaign, carried decisive weight here. The German plan depended on cloud cover to nullify Allied air superiority. Once the skies cleared, P-47s and Typhoons would return to the roads, the crossroads, and the forest corridors where the German columns were most exposed. Commanders studying the reports understood what this meant. Their timetable, already slipping, would soon face a force they had no reserves to counter. The window that protected the offensive was closing. On the ground, American reinforcements continued to flow into critical junctions. Engineer units rebuilt defensive obstacles. Tank destroyer battalions arrived at road networks just hours before German units could seize them. Each arrival tightened the limits of German maneuver and further restricted access to the few operational supply routes Germany still possessed. As the front compressed, Kampfgruppe Peiper's advance stalled near La Glaise, surrounded on multiple sides by American forces converging on the village. Supplies inside the spearhead were nearly gone. Fuel stocks dwindled to unusable levels, and the skies to the west, dark the night before, showed the first pale indications of clearing. When the weather fully broke, the offensive's exposed columns would face the return of Allied air power, and the fate of every forward German unit would shift abruptly from breakthrough to survival. A soldier from Kampfgruppe Peiper walked through the streets of La Glaise at first light, kicked a frozen jerrycan out of his path, and watched it skid across the ice before coming to rest against the wall of a burned-out house. The silence after the impact told him everything he needed to know about their supply situation. The weather broke on 23rd December, and the change was immediate. Cloud cover thinned, then dissipated, revealing clear winter skies across the Ardennes. Within hours, Allied aircraft returned to the front. P-47 Thunderbolts and Hawker Typhoons swept over the roads, firing rockets and heavy machine guns into anything that moved. German columns, stretched along forest tracks and village streets, were now exposed to the full weight of Allied air power. Vehicles burned along road margins. Abandoned tanks steamed in the cold air as crews fled into the trees. This shift magnified the supply crisis that had already paralyzed much of the offensive. Fuel convoys could no longer travel during the day, and several were destroyed before reaching their destinations. Frontline commanders reported that entire armored companies were immobile. Peiper's spearhead, cut off from resupply, began rationing ammunition and food in quantities too small to sustain combat effectiveness. The unit's tactical strength remained significant, but its operational usefulness had evaporated. South of the spearhead, the units encircling Bastogne faced the same constraints. Their siege lines stretched thin as temperatures dropped. Some soldiers tried to warm their hands over small stoves made from ammunition tins, though the flames barely held in the wind. Rations dwindled, bread was reduced to fragments. Medical stations struggled with frostbite cases and lacked the bandages and salves needed to treat them. The failure to seize Bastogne and Saint-Vith on schedule now shaped the entire battlefield. Both towns controlled the paved routes that Germany needed to sustain the offensive. Forced to remain on forest tracks, the German advance slowed even further under constant air attack. Commanders reviewing the updated maps understood, without needing it explained, that the operational timetable at the heart of the plan was gone. What had been conceived as a rapid strike had become a stalled, exposed mass of armor without the means to maneuver. By 22nd to 23rd December, Peiper's group was encircled at La Glaise. Attempts to break out failed. American forces closed the remaining gaps and cut off every viable escape corridor. Ammunition in the village dropped to a few rounds per gun. Crews dismantled weapons they could not carry and buried documents before slipping out through back roads and wooded ravines. Elsewhere, German units attempted their own withdrawals. Some tried to cross the Amblev River under cover of darkness, plunging into the freezing water with rifles held overhead. Many never reached the opposite bank. Those who did emerged half-frozen, leaving a trail of abandoned gear in the snow behind them. Across the front, the German offensive contracted into a defensive posture. What remained of the armored strength was locked in place by empty fuel tanks. Infantry formations, weakened by hunger and cold, could no longer sustain pressure. And above them, the clear winter sky remained unbroken, ensuring the roads, villages, and retreat routes stayed within view of Allied aircraft. By the time the fighting subsided, Germany had taken roughly 100,000 casualties, lost irreplaceable armor to fuel starvation, and burned through the last strategic reserves intended to defend the Reich itself. The tanks left intact couldn't move. The fuel that might have powered them no longer existed. Officers on the ground understood what this meant, even before the High Command admitted it. The Ardennes offensive had consumed the final margin of strength Germany possessed. The war had not ended yet, but after the snows of the Bulge, it could no longer be won.